Hello, hello. Welcome to Political Frenemies. This is the podcast where a conservative and a liberal Democrat talk politics, but we still remain friends. I'm Chris Newton. My day job is a historian. I'm a military historian. I'm also a former conservative defence policy advisor. And with me is Mathew Hulbert, Lib Dem activist and former councillor. Now, this has been quite an extraordinary week, quite a historic week in many ways. Lots of news items happening, lots going on. We've had military exchanges between India and Pakistan. We've got a new pope. And we've also had VE Day as well, the VE Day 80th anniversary commemorations. Now, as I said, I'm a military historian. Now, these big commemorations are like our equivalent of the general election or the World Cup. So during this time, you would have seen lots of historians appearing on the media, and I was honoured to do a little bit of media during the week. But it has been an extremely moving week, remembering those that fought and died and made sacrifices during the Second World War, and it has been a week of reflection on the past as well as the present and the future as well. So it has been a big week. Any reflections, any thoughts about the week and those events, Mathew?
Well, I agree with you that it's been a really big week, Chris. Lots going on, lots of news, some of which we'll be reflecting in this podcast. Before we get too far along, Chris, on the day that we're recording this, it is Europe Day, and I know that you will be celebrating, Chris. So can I say to you, Happy Europe Day? And I really hope that it does look as actually, and I give this government some credit, which is not something that either of us do very often on this podcast, but it does look as if this government is making overtures to the EU to say that although we're no longer in it, much to my sadness, that we should remain good friends with our European neighbours, and we absolutely should. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity, Chris, of you celebrating Europe Day on this wonderful day.
Look, I know we have at least one or two viewers and listeners from the continent, good friends, and look, and yeah, I will say to you and to them, Happy Europe Day. But I've always but people shouldn't mistaken Brexiteers. They shouldn't mistaken Brexiteers as people who hate Europe. We love Europe, and we love the diversity in of the various different European nations, and of course we always want to cooperate and we always want to get along with Europe. The bit that we object to is the European Union and the and the EU institutions. The EU isn't the same as Europe, so if you are on the continent and listening to this, that's what I would say. We're much better when we cooperate, but because we're very different, and I respect the various differences, we might not be necessarily great in terms of political integration because we have different political cultures, and if you are listening to this on the continent, you would have a flavour of how different our political culture is. But I like I say, if you want to celebrate Europe Day, knock yourself out. You can do that, but I would just gently say that we're good as friends, and sometimes friendship is better than marriage. So just bear that in mind.
Well, I would say, Chris, that I very much hope that in my lifetime we will have recognised our collective mistake. I use the word "our." Of course, I voted for Remain, but our country's decision to leave the EU, and that we will rejoin. That is my heartfelt wish, and certainly the heartfelt wish of all Liberal Democrats. So we'll see if that happens. But as you say, it's been, to be serious, it's been a very big week, and of course we. A week where we've honoured those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms, so that we are able to do things like this and peacefully disagree and to remain friends after. So certainly a lot to be thankful for this week.
Yeah, and I would just like to reiterate sort of my expressions of gratitude and thanks to those who served our country, not just during the Second World War, but continue to do it to this day. And no doubt, European security is going to be a big issue on this podcast going forward. And of course, we are due. I don't think next week. I think it's May the 19th, where there's supposed to be an EU UK summit, where there's going to be, hopefully from the perspective of people who want an agreement, there's going to be some kind of trade agreement. So I'm sure we're going to get into Brexit.
We should all want an agreement, Chris.
Well, we would like an agreement that would, which is beneficial to the UK. So and not
well,
just
to both sides.
Not
That's
just
what agreements are.
Yeah, well, but obviously we don't want Keir Starmer to just throw things away and to make concession after concession. And we'll probably talk about Keir Starmer's negotiating style during the course of this podcast. As I say,
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Chris, before we moved on to the main thrust of the podcast, that you mentioned that you'd been on GB News this week doing your analysis, which is fab. And I've had a bit of a media-tastic week too, because I had a bit published by the Daily Express. Now, perfectly true to say, they're not my usual political kind of bedfellows, it has to be said. But I feel very honoured that they published my words online this week, talking about the NHS and calling on West Streeting to take action on unacceptable ambulance delays, which have affected so many families, including my own. And then today, that we're recording this Friday, I was on Talk a little bit earlier talking about this issue, which we won't necessarily go into on this podcast, but about blasphemy laws and free speech and the courts and all of that. So we've been getting out and about a bit, haven't we, this week?
Yeah, and that was a very moving article as well on in the Express, and I would urge people to read that. I've also been on LBC this week, so we've been on kind of opposite sort of stations or outlets which are kind of opposite to our political sort of ideologies, although no doubt Ian Dale would disagree with me there, but it's great that we're both willing to talk to the other side, as it were. But we've both been very busy this week, and obviously it's a very busy week for a historian like me. But this is our bread and butter. This is our home, and let's get on with the main business, shall we? Let's get on with the main event. Okay, so what we are going to do this week, because it's been a strange week, some of it, as we've said, been devoted to VE Day, and it's been bipartisan and so forth, but there has been a fair amount of politics as well, and there's been quite a lot of stories, and all of it, you could say, is following from the local elections, and so this episode is going to be devoted. It's going to be called the local election fallout. So we're going to discuss perhaps some different stories, but all under this banner. So we've got so obviously Reform UK very successful last week with the local elections, and that has been reflected in the polls during the course of this week. Now, in terms of the projected vote from the national election, the BBC had Reform doing very well on, I think it was 29-30%, and Labour on 20%. And those kinds of figures have been reflected in the various polls this week as well. So on the day of recording, on the Friday, we've just had a BMG research poll come out with Reform on 32%, Labour on 22%. We've got a Find Out Now poll as well on Reform on 33%, Labour on 20%. The Conservatives, interestingly, on 16%, and the Lib Dems on 15%. So some of the polls put the Conservatives and the Lib Dems very, like, the Tories were only 1 point ahead. So that's a very interesting observation as well. And we've also had the Labour government has been busy this week in terms of signing trade deals. It signed a trade deal with India, and it signs a deal which they hopefully is the first stage of a much more wider agreement with Donald Trump and the United States as well. So maybe we were going to be asking a bit later, will that make any blind bit of difference to Labour's fortunes or not? But sticking with Reform, first of all, and their successes in terms of the poll ratings at the moment, and that's been obviously reflected in real votes as well last week. What do you make of it? What do you make of Reform's success, and can Reform maintain this momentum?
Well, it's been a really interesting week for Reform because, in a sense, two different things have been happening. So, on the one hand, as you mentioned, they're doing very well in the polls, and you mentioned the within the past half an hour or so, the BMG poll for the I paper, which has Reform at 32%, Labour at 22%, so a 10-point lead for Reform. Tories at 19%, Lib Dems 13%, Greens 9%. And so, clearly we're seeing big numbers for Reform. So they're continuing to be popular, as you'd expect them to. I mean, I find it saddening, but you'd nonetheless expect them to be just a week after they did so well in the polls. But also this week, and not so much commented on by the media, is that, now I appreciate it's probably only a handful, if not fewer, but nonetheless, we've seen the beginnings of what could become something to note politically, which is that a number of their councillors have already gone by the wayside, have either been suspended by the party for whatever reason, or have decided to leave the party, or I read, I think it was Nottinghamshire County Council, which Reform now run overall, so up here in the East Midlands, where I think it was two of the prospective Reform councillors couldn't become councillors because they were members of the armed forces and weren't allowed to be. So I mean, I said on Twitter that in my usual fair and balanced way, I said that what a bunch of rank amateurs that Reform are. Now, you can either agree with me or not on that, but I do think that I think this could become a rolling trend as the weeks go on, that their success becomes a bit tarnished from their perspective, because actually councillors, for whatever reason, are not able to either take up their position, or are suspended, or leave the party, or whatever. And so I think they're realising that it's one thing getting people elected, it's another keeping cohesive groups of people together and to actually run councils.
Now, I would agree that there is a steep learning curve here, and what you outlined, is an example, or several examples of that. And there's also the fact that they announced a policy, because the media has been pressuring them for policies and keep asking them, well, what are you going to do for these councils? So the first sort of policy collectively that, or at least the leadership has made in relation to local councils, has been to only fly the Union flag and the well, if it's in England, the English flag in council buildings. And of course, people pointed out, well, what about the county flags? So so eventually, Reform had to say, oh yeah, we will include the county flags on in this as well. I mean, clearly the policy was aimed at not flying the Palestine flag and the Pride flag, and probably the Ukraine flag as well, and other flags. But again, it just is another example where, okay, they've really got to step up their game in this sense, in policy development terms. So
But
there is an
if I
element
can
of
just bring
that.
there, Chris, doesn't it say something that, when they're asked the question by the media, is they're bound to be now they're actually in charge of some councils. What are you going to do? What are you going to deliver for your residents? And the first thing that they come up with is a kind of culture war thing. I'd have more respect for them, Chris, if they're actually, even if I obviously disagree with them politically, I'd have more respect for Reform councillors if they actually talked about the bread and butter issues, if they talked about what they're going to do about adult social care, etc. But for them, and this is my issue with them, for them, it seems to be, with the vast majority of them, if not all of them, all about culture war issues. We're going to stop diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're not going to have the pride flag or whatever it is from our buildings. I'm like, guys, you are now in charge of these councils, and as I said, on this podcast last week, Chris, whether they like it or not now, they've got to get down to the boring and mundane but important bit of actually running these services, of actually delivering budgets. And I just think a lot of these people, I obviously don't know them all individually, so I can't claim to be speaking about all of them, but I think a good number, that for them, it's not about delivery. It's all about their ideological position, and I think some of them are going to have to learn about delivering and politics and running a council really very quickly.
There may be some to that, something to that, but you talk about flying the flags, but a lot of, I mean, firstly, that's a national story. That's clearly something for from the leadership to communicate nationally. We don't really know what the local councillors are saying in each locality, so they might be saying something more local in that. But come on, a lot of the stories that I see emanating from councils is about Green or Lib Dem or Labour councils or independent councils flying the Palestinian flag or flying the Pride flag. So it's not just something. It's not just Reform waging the culture war. It's in many ways a response to other parties doing this in the first place. So first of all, let's not pretend that this is just a Reform thing. Likewise, kind of stories of incompetence and sort of defections. There's been defections to Reform as well during the course of the last week. So and at council level, yes, you get very hard-working councils doing real good for their local communities, but at the same time, you get some real Fruit Loops as well, and that's the case for all political parties. So I'm sure if you look far enough, you can dig up embarrassing stories about Labour, Tory, and Lib Dem councillors. But another thing is that we have all of these embarrassing stories, and and during the general election campaign, there was poor vetting on the part of Reform, and the leadership accepted that there was poor vetting, and there does seem to be a vetting issue still within Reform. But you have these mistakes and you have these gaffes. You had, as I said last week, the Rupert Lowe thing as well, and it's not impacting Reform at all. It's if anything, the votes, the vote in the polling's going up. So have we come to a stage? Have we come to a stage where none of this actually matters? A lot of the public have made their mind up. They're fed up with the two main parties.
Yeah, just on that, Chris, I had a cuppa and a catch up earlier today with a journalist friend of mine, and I was saying to him that, yeah, I mean, it does seem that things that might shock the likes of me and perhaps even you, Chris, are already priced in by Reform voters, a bit like Trump voters over in the state. So it's already priced in that these are quite controversial people who might do and say some quite controversial things. And who won't necessarily do things in a way you might expect them to be done. But I do think that quite often Trump voters and Reform voters, Nigel Farage voters, have already priced those things in. So just because they have situations like some of which they've seen this week, which might make some of us think like me, gosh, what a bunch of amateur people we're dealing with here, won't necessarily cause any concern at all for their voters. And so I do think that those of us in the mainstream parties, the older parties, have got to recognise that we can't just sit back and wait for Reform to implode, which they may or may not do, and hope that happens. We have got to fight our corner and talk about our principles and our values and our policies. Each and every day to try and win some of those voters back. And of course, it's more difficult when you're in opposition, like the Lib Dems, because you nationally, I'm talking about, obviously we're in power locally in quite a lot of councils, including in 3 new county councils after last week's elections. But certainly in terms of Labour and the government, they're in government nationally, and they are able to deliver. And I really agreed with Andrew Rawnsley's column in the Observer last Sunday, where he said that the best response to the politics of the likes of Farage is to actually deliver people, which of course is what I've been saying for quite a few weeks now. And I think that is what Labour have been trying to begin to do this week. Of course, they wanted to get off talk about the local elections, which were so bad for them, and they wanted to get on to these trade deals, which from their perspective they see as big and important. Now, whether they are or not, we can get into in a wee while here, but they clearly want to get onto the delivery part, which they see as being the only way back for them. And I agree with that. But I think so. We're in a really interesting time politically. Can Labour deliver? If they deliver, will that impact on the voters, or have the voters already priced in that they want this to be just a one-term Labour government? And for Reform, will they keep being successful in the polls for the foreseeable? Yeah, I imagine that they will. But equally, I think for at least some of their voters, it will matter whether they deliver at a local level. And I know you say that all parties have some what we might call odd people in them. That's absolutely true. All parties have their issues. Most councils have their issues, but Reform have got to realise that because this is the first time they've actually started running something, there is bound to be a lot of attention paid to them, and whether they like it or not, that is going to be the case. The media is going to be watching these councils that they run like hawks, and so that's why I expect a lot to be being put out from the centre, from Reform HQ or whatever you want to call it, making sure that these councils are doing what they need to do.
Yeah, just just one point on that, just before we get to the Labour Party and the Labour government, maybe one response from the mainstream parties is not automatically make the assumption that reform councillors and councillors are going to be crap without seeing, without actually knowing what's going to happen. Surely a better response is to actually give the voters some credit, for what they're voting, understand why they voted reform, and perhaps not make the assumption, because it could
But you're
come across as a bit snobby, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and there is a worry that you come off as a bit patronising. But I think it's two separate things that aren't. I think it's two separate things. So I think my view is that, and again, I hope I'm wrong, because I don't want these communities to be let down. So in a sense, I really hope I'm wrong. I fear that I'll be proved right, however, and that certainly in the beginning, a lot of these councils are going to rely heavily on the officers, because they are complete newbies. They've never run anything before. A lot of them have never even been councillors, opposition councillors, or whatever before, and so I think there will be mistakes made. But I really hope I'm wrong. But I think that is different to disrespecting the voters. I understand that the voters were sick to death of the two old parties, both Labour and the Conservatives. They want change. They're fed up of how certain things in the country are run, and so they've voted for change. Now, in the vast majority of cases, that has been voting for reform. In some of the cases, it's meant voting for the Lib Dems, but they're certainly and the Greens, but they're certainly fed up of the two old parties. But I don't think it's disrespecting the voters to say that some of the folks in reform don't necessarily know what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, but I think the it needs to be based on evidence, and not simply just making the blanket assumption before the fact actually happens. Yes, I mean, this week I admit, I concede, you've got some evidence, and as I said, there's some work for reform to do there, but I'm just a bit I don't necessarily agree that we'll just have to see. I mean, I don't necessarily agree that that we can just make an assumption without knowing who these people are, and so we'll just have to see. And it'll be very interesting to see whether they make an impact, whether they improve things, whether the services, because there's a lot of complaints about things like bin collections and potholes and so forth, which have been long running complaints, and maybe reform attract people who might actually do something about that kind of thing. I don't know. We'll have to see. But I personally wouldn't necessarily make the judgment straight away. We'll just have to wait and see, as indeed the general policy development and party development of reform, and how they build and develop and so forth. Now,
yeah, and we have got to see how it goes. And if I end up eating my words, then I shall look forward to doing that. And as I say, part of me really hopes that I'm wrong, because this will affect my own county here in Leicestershire, where I am, where I live, and because Reform are, albeit a minority administration here, but they're now in charge. I expect they'll be reliant on the votes of the Tories. So it'll be interesting to see if the now Tory opposition will be any kind of modifying force on reform. So we wait and see about that. But of course, I want our services to be properly delivered here in Leicestershire. And look, I promise to you, Chris, and I say this to our viewers and listeners, if it turns out that here and elsewhere reform actually managed to be competent, then I shall come on here and eat crow and say that and say that I was wrong. I don't really expect to have to be doing that, but who knows?
Okay, right. We'll have to see. Moving on to the Labour Party, and it's been an interesting week for Labour. for the government. You had earlier on, I say earlier on, this was last Friday, the absolute worst response that they could give to the local election drubbing, which was Lucy Powell on any questions, I believe, was basically dismissive. Well, Tim Montgomery raised the grooming gangs and I think Channel 4 documentary, and Lucy Powell said, you're going to bring that dog whistle up again, and again, extremely insensitive remark on a very sensitive topics, so to speak. So that was a terrible response. But the Tories never really, I think, properly, although they did make some noise. I just think I don't think that the Tories really pressured Starmer or Lucy Powell enough. I think there was a potential for a resignation there, which the Tories didn't take.
You were amazed, weren't you, Chris, on social media this week? You were amazed that Badenoch didn't go with it at PMQs this week.
Yeah. I just thought. I just thought that was a real point of discomfort for the government, and also it was an absolute, in my opinion, a terrible remark, and I just feel that should have been the issue that she should have went on. But the government has also had an interesting week in the sense that they've signed a trade deal with India, which reduced tariffs on certain things, and of course they had the trade deal with America as well, and the sheer sort of chaos of announcing it in coordination with Donald Trump, which they achieved something, in the sense of reducing the tariffs for cars and having as a tariff-free arrangement in terms of steel and aluminium, but the baseline tariff of 10% on most other things still remains. So there's a lot of analysis of that. The Indian deal that had an interesting part of that in relation to national insurance, where seconded Indian workers were exempt from, or are exempt from, national insurance payments for 3 years, and that's caused controversy as well. What do you make of Labour's week? A good week, a week where it recovered? Will any of these deals make any difference to their fortunes?
Oh, I think it's going to be a lot of hard work and quite a long time before they begin to recover. But I do think, from their perspective, certainly in comparison with last week, it was a better week for the government. It couldn't really have been a worse one for them after their election drubbing last week. And clearly Starmer and his cabinet wanted to move on. And clearly those were two big announcements this week. Now, we'll all have to look at the details of that. What I would say, though, is that, obviously by their very nature, agreements mean a bit of give and take. And I know that, Kemi Badenoch came out with, the government have been shafted and all of that. And, and clearly she's doing her job as leader of the opposition in that respect. But I think anyone sensible would recognise that there's give and take in brokering these deals, and I guess you pay your money and you take your choice about whether we've given up too much in comparison to the benefit that we get. But at least deals are being signed, and I'm really interested to see the response of those Brits who, many of them no doubt reform voters here in the UK, who really like Donald Trump, and to hear Donald Trump with his effusive praise of Keir Starmer this week. I bet that boggles the minds of some of those people, because they tend to not like Keir Starmer at all, but really like Donald Trump. So I bet that messed with their heads, bless them. But to hear,
I don't know. I don't necessarily think so. I think certainly, sort of my opinion. I don't think he's 100% sincere. I'm talking Donald Trump here
is he ever
with his
sincere?
praise. Uh, so I don't know if he's truly kind of reflecting what he really thinks of him, and I think most people can square it with the idea that, yes, we all know that Donald Trump and Keir Starmer think very differently on most issues, if not all issues, and come from very different ideological perspectives and points of view. But ultimately, Trump has always been a big fan of the United Kingdom. He's obviously you've got the family connection there. He's always said how much he loves the United Kingdom. So I think Trump is willing to put some of these personal issues aside to build the relationship with the United Kingdom. And I think he's been doing that with other people as well. He did the same with Carney as well this week as well. A very interesting press conference, despite everything that Mark Carney said about Trump. That press conference went pretty well, I think, from the perspective of Mark Carney. Mark Carney's not so tough when he's encountering Donald Trump face to face now, is he? He's not so
But equally,
he's not so big on the rhetoric there, is he?
But equally, Donald Trump wasn't as bombastic either, was he? I mean, the fact is that it was actually quite a sensible press conference from the Oval Office, and I think both leaders recognised that actually it's all right doing the noises off to either win an election or to do the Trump bombastic stuff about the 51st state, but actually it's about working together. I mean, they are literally the nearest of neighbours, and so I mean, I guess there was always the potential that could have been an explosive situation there, politically and rhetorically speaking, rather like, albeit different, but rather like the Zelensky thing in the White House was a few months back. But it didn't turn out to be that way at all. And it'll be interesting to see if actually that, rather ironically, if that turns out to be quite a fruitful relationship politically for both countries.
Yeah, and we'll time will tell. It's interesting how things change very quickly. But
can I just say, sorry, Chris, can I just say before I forget, I want to mention that it was really interesting to see Peter Mandelson, who looked like the cat who's got the cream, during the press conference announcing the trade deal. I mean, he really is the comeback kid, isn't he? I was reminding myself, I had a little look on Wikipedia, I think it was earlier today, reminding myself of the career of Peter Mandelson, and he's had more comebacks than Elvis. He and I presume this will be his last big job, but yeah, he's very suave, and isn't he, and very sophisticated.
Oh,
and,
he knows how to charm people, I suppose. And again, Mandelson is another person who's had to backpedal on what he said about Donald Trump in the past. But do you think do you think that this do you think this represents? I've got a frog in my throat. Do you think this represents success in terms of both Starmer and Mandelson's approach? Does this illustrate that that the relationship between Starmer and Trump will be close, that the special relationship endures? And remember what Obama said back in 2016: we'll be at the back of the queue, and actually we're at the front of the queue. We were the first to get one of these trade deals after so-called Liberation Day. So does this represent the fact that that that's actually the relationship with the United States is close, is going to be as good as it gets, or are we too close? Or is Keir Starmer positioning us too close to the United States?
Well, I mean, and I've said this before on this podcast. I mean, despite the fact that I was a big Obama and Biden fan, and I was, I think both of them actually, if not anti the UK, were not exactly best bosom buddies with the UK during their administrations. And so it might just be that despite the fact that they seem very strange bedfellows, it might just be that actually, weirdly, it does work between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer. Now, none of us would necessarily expect it to, but it certainly seemed very warm and cordial yesterday. Now, as I said earlier, you never forget the realpolitik of these things. The fact is, both men, politically and electorally speaking, need to be seen to be doing well, need to be seen to be striking deals. But nonetheless, it did seem genuinely warm between the two. It got to me a bit that Starmer kept calling the president Donald. When it's really personal like that, I really think it should be Mr. Prime Minister and Mr. President.
And Trump wasn't reciprocating at all.
No,
apart from the end, he did. Apart from, I noticed at the end he did. But
yeah,
I mean, he was clearly told to say that, and to say that repeatedly, which I'm not quite sure was the best advice. But
no. But it was really interesting, and obviously it was the beginning of an electoral fight back for the government. Whether it works, whether voters are listening, I mean, I very much doubt that they still are. Just a week on from last week's jobbing for Labour. We should just really quickly, before we end this, Chris, we should really mention the Tories. I mean, doesn't it say something that we have to remember to mention the Conservatives? I mean, I'm sure you'd agree that at the moment they're just not getting through at all. You can almost sometimes forget that they even exist. And for a party as successful as they have been historically, I mean, that's not a good position to be in, is it?
No, and like I said, I mean, at the start of the program, I said, well, it's who's really made any noise this week? Well, it's Reform and Labour, and the Tories are really sort of nowhere. And as I said, they didn't really. I don't really like calling it exploiting an opportunity, because we are talking about a very sensitive issue, but it was nonetheless a political opportunity, which I think was missed. And ministerial scalps are important. They're important for morale. They're the things that you remember. So towards the end, towards election time, it's oppositions tend to trot out the number of Labour ministers that have resigned in disgrace. So that's why I was attacked quite a lot. And there's still some Kemi supporters on Twitter, but I was attacked quite. And don't get me wrong, I like Kemi. But obviously she's not connecting. It's a disaster at the moment in terms of their poll ratings. But they're not exploiting opportunities. They're not making any noise. To what extent is that down to Kemi's style of leadership? And to what extent is that down to lack of resources? I mean, I was astonished. This was a few months ago now. I was astonished to read in Guido Fawkes that CCHQ only has 4 press officers, which from my time just blows my mind. So we generally had a press officer per brief, with the exception of the smaller ones. So clearly they're down on resources, but that is a product of the fact that donors are not viewing her leadership favourably, and are donating to Reform as well. So yeah, I wish I had something positive to say about the Tories, but no, it's very difficult. And as I said, the more that you have the poll ratings, with Reform establishing themselves now over 30%. It's very difficult to see the Tories with whoever leader, if they do replace their leader, recovering from that.
Well, it was interesting that who resurfaced this week in quite a big way, and on GB News, on which you appear, but a certain Mr. Boris Johnson. With quite a high-profile interview that made some headlines, and polls suggest. I mean, I can't fathom this, but obviously, he's not my political cup of tea at all. But polls suggest that he is the only Tory leader that Reform voters think could, have said could get them to switch back from Reform to the Conservatives. I mean, do you think it is at all possible that he'll look to make a return to Parliament and maybe do what the Canadian Conservative leader, Mr. I never know how to say his name. I think it's Mr. Polyev, is attempting to do, and that is that he's managed to the party and him have managed to convince one of the new Conservative MPs in Canada to stand down, having just been elected, so that Mr. Polyev can fight for that seat to return to Parliament. I mean, do you think it's at all likely that Boris could make such a return here in the UK?
Well, if Trump can return, then I suppose Boris can. But it will be, despite it's interesting the polling, and perhaps compared with all of the other Tory leadership contenders, then maybe better Boris is the best out of the lot. But the moment he returns, then his past will be brought up, and he's annoyed quite a lot of people, not just Remainers, but of course COVID as well. There's a lot of people who are annoyed with his lockdown policy and so forth. So the list of enemies that he's accrued over the years has got bigger, even since the Brexit days. So I find it very difficult to see it work, but you never know. Just one point about the Lib Dems before, because we are going to wrap this up for very, very quickly. Just to make sure, just to be inclusive, and to make sure that all the parties,
as you always
all the
are,
main parties are covered. Now, Ed Davey has made a lot of noise about the US trade deal. He's calling for a vote. But let's face it, that if Ed Davey was in a coalition government right now, he'd be exactly the same as all of the Labour ministers now, and agreeing with such a deal and saying that it's important to be to establish relations with the United States. So is there a problem there? And also, I noticed that Prime Minister's questions as well, that, again, the only two issues that he brings up there is Trump and social care, which, don't get me, is a very important issue. We need to talk about social care. That's fine. But if he wants to make the same kind of impact that Reform is making at the moment, he's got to talk about more issues than that, and maybe step into difficult territory and talk about issues that Reform and the rest of the public are talking about.
Well, you say that, Chris, but what we have to remember, and I have to remind myself about this too, is that for those of us that are political watchers, that spend every day kind of watching the news and reading the political press and all the rest of it, we might get a bit fed up of the likes of my party leader raising the same thing at Prime Minister's question every week. But for most people who aren't political obsessives and who go about their lives and who perhaps just catch a clip on the news on the evening news at the end of the day, sometimes you do have to repeat things ad nauseum to kind of get through to many voters. So I'd say that about Ed Davey. I do just want to also mention, because again we need to be fair here, that the Greens have had an interesting week. My former Lib Dem colleague, late of the Lib Dems, Zach Polanski, has announced that he is running to be leader of the Green Party. And a lot of actual political journalists didn't clearly know this this week, and you'd expect them to know their stuff on this. But actually, there was scheduled to be a Green leadership election anyway this year, as part of the way they run in the Green Party. Carla Denyer has announced, currently one of the co-leaders, that she's not running again. Adrian Ramsey is yet to make such an announcement, but I expect perhaps will. I personally don't think he'll be running again, but we'll see that. And we'll see who else runs. But I think it's a shoo-in for Zach Polanski to become the leader of the Greens. And whether you agree with him or not, he's a very good communicator, and I think could do big things for the Greens. So we'll see what happens there. And I also want to just mention, Chris, because again, we don't want to be England centric, do we, on this podcast? So I want to mention the fact that the SNP this week have announced all of their candidates for next year's Holyrood elections, and if the current polls are to be believed, the SNP are set to win big, and perhaps be just shy of a majority, but to win big next year, which, looking back just a few months, didn't seem likely. And also, interestingly, this week we need to keep an eye on what's been happening in Wales as well, where it looks as if, number one, it looks as if Reform will have a fairly big group of members of the Senate, members of the Welsh Parliament, elected if current polls are anything to go by. But also, and perhaps the biggest news, that it looks as if Labour might be ousted from what we're so used to calling Labour-run Wales next year, unless they can do something really surprising between now and election day. And that it may well be, for the first time ever, a Plaid-led government running Wales next year. So it's fantastic for a political podcast like ours, Chris, because I don't think I can remember actually more interesting political times than what we're living through right now.
Things are definitely being shaken up, and as I say, I mean that potential change in Wales. I mean, things can always happen and change. I mean that would be really big, because Wales, you think of Wales and you just think Labour, so and Plaid as well. But yeah, but that's going to be very interesting to watch as well. Okay, right. That's it for another week. We've got a very exciting week. As we've always say, we have no idea what's going to come up next week, so who knows what we're going to be talking about. But that's it for now.
Can I just say, please do, I know I say it every week, I'm going to continue to do it. Please do all the internet-y things. Please do like, please do subscribe. Please do follow us on Twitter or whatever it's called now at Frenemies. Please do all of that. Please do tell your friends. We're building an audience. We really appreciate it. However you watch or listen to us, and we know that our short videos, which Chris, bless him, puts out for us, are really, really popular. So they clearly only want us in small chunks. So that's clearly what they want. But no, we're really happy. We enjoy doing this, number one thing, and the fact that some of you watch and listen as well is an added bonus. And so we'll look forward to next week. Really looking forward to it. As I say, politics is unpredictable at the moment. We've had an unpredictable week this week. Who knows what's going to happen next week? So it's goodbye from me. Bye from me. Goodbye. We'll see you next time on Political Frenemies.